Welcome to the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast, where we talk to computer scientists who immigrated from their home countries for study or for work or for other reasons. In these oral history interviews, you will find established and renowned computer scientists from across academia and industry narrating their experiences of immigrating from where they grew up to a completely different land, often the US. My name is Indy Gupta, and I'm your host. The 1970s and 80s are essentially prehistoric times for computer science. This was before Windows was popular, and Apple's first computer was released in 1976. And of course, the internet as we know it today did not exist back then in the 1970s and early 80s. So what was computer science like in the 1970s and 1980s around the world? What was it like studying computer science? Were there computer science departments in universities outside the US? The answers might surprise you. I spoke with three prominent computer scientists who grew up and studied computer science on three different continents in the 1970s and 80s before they immigrated to the US. They studied, respectively, in Europe, in South America, and in Africa. Their countries are, respectively, Yugoslavia, Brazil, and Egypt. Those are our three acts today. Our narrators today, Dejan Milojicic of Hewlett-Packard Labs, then Rico Malvar of Microsoft, and last, Amr El Abbadi of the University of California at Santa Barbara. This is a remix episode. You can find the full interviews with these three prominent computer scientists in episodes 4, 6, and 12 of this podcast. In Act 1, we talked to Dejan Milojicic, Distinguished Technologist at Hewlett-Packard Labs and IEEE Fellow. He grew up in Yugoslavia. Dejan did his BSc and MSc in the University of Belgrade in Yugoslavia from 1978 to 83 and 1983 to 86. Next, moving on to your college year. So it's around 1978 when you started your BSc. So as you're considering university, did you have a choice of major? Do you actually choose electrical engineering, or was it through some exam system? How was the admission process?
No, at the beginning you choose which university you go to. So that's all Belgrade University. So I chose faculty of electronic and electrical engineering. And the first year was common for everybody. At that time, there was electronics, there was power and energy, and there was automation and a few others centers. But the first year was common for everyone. And then in the second year, I was expected to choose where to go, and I chose electronics. I still don't know why, but that's what I chose. It appealed to me somehow. It was more interesting than everything else.
And were there constraints on the choice in the sense of, you could choose something only if it's if you have a good enough GPA? I mean, was it competitive to choose particular majors over others?
I don't think there were any issues at that time. They wanted to balance, so they opened up to anyone, as far as I remember. You couldn't get the first year because, they wouldn't accept everyone. But once you're in, they allow us to choose which direction to take.
Focusing on your just BSc years, 1978 to 83, how much emphasis would you say was there on the electrical and electronics engineering side versus the software side in those years of education?
There wasn't any software. I'm not sure that I've done any software until I started working, which was in 83. Even the first program that I wrote, it was nothing. It was Fortran for some computers. I almost didn't do any software. It was all electronics and, electromagnetism and engineering. It was all engineering. I got interest in programming only in the Master of Science and then while working in parallel.
So you're reaching the end of your BSc Are you already starting to do research while you're a bachelor student, or
No research. No research during bachelor.
and what made you choose the MSc? Was it just the logical next step, or was it something that?
Well, I always wanted to continue. I continue studying. So I finished in '83. There were all kinds of interesting things there that I may share if you care about. But since you asked me, I wanted to go after the Bachelor of Science to United States to study there, to continue. But I couldn't secure anything. I went through some friends, this or that. It didn't work. And so instead, I went to work where I did the practical project. So you're supposed to do 4.5 years of Bachelor of Science, and the ninth semester or the 10th semester, really, or the one half of the last year, you expected to do the practical project. So at that point, I went to Institute Mihailo Pupin, and there I've done, which was really interesting, some logic for the hybrid computer. So they were building a computer, a hybrid computer, analog digital, and I was asked to verify some logic for controlling the analog part. And if you will, that was actually the first time I was exposed to research. So I wasn't right. That part was really research. But these 4.5 years, there was no research. It was just studying, which was in a way good, because almost after that, I didn't do any studying. I was doing only research, including for Master of Science and PhD. I'll explain that later. But at that point, they were very pragmatic. So the person who was my advisor for Bachelor of Science, he asked me to fix this. I fixed it. In addition, I designed better choice, and he told me, well, okay, so now go and keep on fixing things. I said, well, I don't want to keep on fixing things. It may be of interest to you. For me, it's more interesting to do research and do the thesis. He didn't like that. But I wrote the Bachelor of Science thesis, which was really good. They really appreciated it. They thought that was one of the best, even though they didn't like that I didn't work for them. But that's a trade-off. And then, because I wanted to go to US, I told those in institute that I don't want to stay there, because they wanted to hire me. And I said, look, I want to go to United States. And I said, okay, nice, goodbye. And once I didn't secure going to United States, I came back. That project didn't have openings, but I got hired by someone else who knew that I was good, so they hired me. So for about a year, I didn't do anything because there wasn't any project. They just hired me as a backup. But then they started a very, very interesting project of building their own multibus one base computer for the banks and post offices. So they develop everything from scratch, hardware, they even computers, they even build the monitors, and then software, the system software for this hardware and
The
the
whole stack.
application,
Yeah.
the whole stack. And I was responsible for system software. I was one of the three people. I worked with two colleagues who were really great guys, and I learned a lot from them. And the interesting thing is that at that time, because I again liked doing research, so I did the same work as a practical thesis for Master of Science. So I did literature survey and all of that. I noticed that the competition at most had 2 users per their computers, and we managed to put 16 users on a single board. So that was one 8086, and then 16 users in addition. And it was quite interesting because it was advanced development, but it was also the product that eventually went to all banks, post offices. So that was a great satisfaction going to banks and post offices and sneaking behind these places where they work to see whether they have our own monitors and computers.
The real users and real systems that they use. You got exposed to that pretty early in your career.
Very early. So, no jokes. You have to deliver. And, and we went to the trade shows, exposed those, it was the full experience, from conceiving it from nothing to conceiving it to developing, testing, etc. And then we went on to 386. For 386, we expected to port Unix, so we bought actually Unix System 5. At that time, it was, I think we got 3.2 and then 4.0 from AT&T. We got the full software, but we never used that one. We just used we bought the binaries and just developed device drivers. So again, I was doing device drivers for all kinds of equipment, starting from the bootstrap. I worked with a colleague of mine who lives here now in the United States. That's how we started. He did the first things, but then I've done all kinds of device drivers for the serial lines, then for disks, for network, tapes, etc.
Tell us a bit about the Institute Mikhailo Pupin. Was it allied with the university or was it a standalone entity? Did it have funding from the government? What was its charter?
It was both. It was extremely entrepreneurial. So that project that I was telling you was driven by the director of our lab. Out of, I think at that time there were like 11 labs. It was pretty big. It was over 1,000 people. It was, I think, almost as big as HP Labs when I came here. And it had all kinds of things. They were aligned with universities but independent. And they've done for all kinds of governments around the world because Yugoslavia was non-aligned. They were able to work for Western and Eastern countries, and they leveraged it quite well.
This is the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast interview with Dejan Milojicic, distinguished technologist at HP Labs and immigrant from Yugoslavia. You mentioned earlier that towards the end of your BSc, you applied to US universities. Was there a particular reason you wanted to come to the US?
It's a longer story. So my great uncle, he left Yugoslavia, Belgrade, Serbia, however you want it, when I was 5 years old. And he would occasionally come back. And I always wanted to go and visit him. I remember I was 15 years old when I declared to my grandparents that I'm going to visit him. And they were so concerned because they knew I was stubborn and I would just do it no matter what. So they convinced me somehow. There was a council of my aunts got together to, explain to me, hey, Dan, you're still a kid. You don't travel to the United States like that. So I eventually went after high school. I went there. He wanted to keep me there to study at university there. I didn't want at that time, because I saw he was living in a little village. It was nearby Dallas. There was McKinney, which is little town. Mm-hmm. Then there was another town, Altoga, and then he lived by that one. So it was.
So you visited here when you were a teenager, briefly.
18 years old, yeah, but I didn't want to stay. I said, no way, I'm going back, center of Belgrade, friends, all that. And I thought it was a good choice at that time. But then when I finished university, I wanted to go, but I didn't even apply. I was trying to go through personal connections. That's how it works. You probably know in India, there's a lot of things that are done through personal connections, but none of them panned out. So, if I have known, as I knew later, I would have applied regularly and it would have happened. But I didn't know how to do it, and so it didn't happen. So I stayed and I worked, and actually it was a good choice because I learned tons of things at that institute. I still, to this day, I am proud of all the things I've done there.
Looking back on your BSc, MSc, and also your school years, you mentioned your aunt, and you mentioned, I think, one professor who you worked with in undergrad. Were there other mentors or role models who you think influenced your path, your career path, in the longer run?
I think I was trying to get the best of anyone. I never had a single role model. That professor I liked a lot. There's interesting story with him I'd like to share. He was really tough. He was the toughest. It's not like in the United States where everybody passes or most everybody passes all the time. It's just difference in grade. He prevented a lot of students to finish university, not on purpose, but he maintained some standard, and if you don't meet that standard, he doesn't let you pass. So he was really, everybody was afraid. One of my best friends stopped university because of him. He could never pass his exam. So I took that exam, not on the first occasion when I was given opportunity, but on the second. And I did, it was success to even pass, to get the lowest grade. It was really, and I did, but he said, okay, here's the grade, go away. And I said, I don't want it, the way he told me. And so I rejected it. And people were shocked that I've done that. So I come for the next exam and I get the same grade. It was all written, both. He wasn't there. And I felt stupid. Okay, I canceled the first time. So I canceled the second time. So I get third time in front of him. And in the meanwhile, because he was horrible presenter, teacher, he was very smart, but he couldn't explain anything. Everyone has his strengths and weaknesses. So I clarified everything, with him. I went, met him personally, asked him everything. I felt I knew everything, but the trick with him is he always comes up with new questions because he wants you to think, not to just learn, he wants you to come, even in the exam, with completely new solutions. So he asked me one question, and I said, I don't know. He asked me second question, I said, I don't know. And he said, okay, go sit back in the room and wait. And it was all good. I don't mind waiting, but I was supposed to fly that night to the seaside to meet my nowadays wife. And he didn't ask me. So, 1 hour passes, second hour passes. So I keep on asking, hey, can you, I'm still here. Can you ask me, say, are you rushing for the train? I said, no, for the plane. And so eventually he asked me and asked me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. I knew everything. And he gave me the middle grade, which was still great. I got 8 out of 10. The 6 is passing. So
that's some tough love from a teacher.
Yeah, and it's good. I appreciate that.
When you were applying for this program in Germany at Kaiserslautern, this is 91, did you consider the US at all at that point?
No. It's interesting. You'll hear later, most of my plans did not pan out the way I wanted them. I wanted to go somewhere I couldn't, then they wanted me, I didn't want to, and it was always like that. But I already applied for the PhD in Belgrade. You don't need to do anything. You just apply with some proposal, and then you expect it to do the work, publish papers, and all of that. And it was approved. But I realized while I could do Masters of Science while working, and even that was a stretch, but I was pretty energetic. So during Master of Science, for example, I used to moonlight in some other company from 4 to 8, then work from 8 to 4, my regular job, and then 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. I did my Masters. So I could do all of that for Masters, but for PhD, it wasn't trivial. For PhD, you have to really spend quality time. So I thought, well, maybe if I go to Germany, spend a year there, I can focus only on research, and then I come back and publish, and but I started that way. I was expected to spend 2 months studying language, which I really enjoy. It was like vacation for me because I already knew language. I studied languages already in elementary school, so I finished both English courses outside in evening classes and German and French. So I didn't really need these 2 months, but I had great time with other students. And then 10 months I really focused on doing research. There, I literally have done it 5 a.m. till 5 p.m. I like these structured ways. So 5 a.m. I was in my office and stayed there until 5 p.m. 5 days a week. And then on Saturdays, I would probably do half a day, and Sunday I would occasionally work and other, because I already had two daughters and I was married, and they both came with me at that time to Germany. But the issue was that because of the war, and professor liked me because he saw I was there every time he comes in the office, I'm there, and I was ambitious. I already had a lot of work done, but don't forget, I was already working in an institute for 5 years, no, 8 years. So I was extremely experienced, and I picked up practical thesis that was Mach microkernel and how to do load distribution on top of it. So I ran it like a project. I had a few students over there who worked with me. I worked with them. So I was able to accomplish a lot. So Professor recognized after a year or even a little bit, few months before that, he can benefit from me, his whole group, and that I was doing a good job. So he offered to me to do PhD there instead of Belgrade. So after a year or a little bit before that, I formally applied for extension of this grant. That was with DAAD, which stands for Deutsche Austausch Akademische Dienst, or Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst, means German academic exchange service. So they extended for one more year, and that wasn't enough, so we extended for 3 more months. So effectively, I was working for 2 years because I lost 2 months in the beginning. So in 2 years, I was able to finish this work that I planned, to write the thesis, and to graduate.
The moonlighting that you described, the work, was that out of necessity or was that just out of interest?
Both. I was about to go to serve the army. It was good to have some money. But I was also intrigued. They came with a hard problem, and I'll tell you what the problem is. It was a really interesting problem, practical one. So that was another company we worked with who were working directly with banks, and they purchased a banknote machine, and it worked well. They connected it to the system, but occasionally it would count. It would drop one count of the banknotes. And you can't do that. You can't miss a single penny with those things. And they realized that because it was Unix machine, it wasn't real time. On certain occasions, the interrupts were blocked, so the protocol wouldn't acknowledge in communication with that machine. It was serial communication board. So they asked me to find a way how to fix it, recommending that I write a device driver for the intelligent board that was there. And I looked at it, and I knew how to do that. I've done all kinds of device drivers. And I got quite a bit of money for that too. But then I thought, well, I want to do it better. So I looked, there was a firmware on the board. So rather than writing the whole device driver, which takes about 3 months to write, or up to 3 months to write, up to 3 months to make it reliable and robust, I changed the firmware just to reply NAC, ACK whenever request comes. So it was a small program. It still took time to debug, test, prove that it works, but I really enjoyed it. And I have to pass it to someone else to maintain it, so they earned some money. I got a lot of money, and I solved the problem for the company. They earn dramatically more money from ability to sell these banknotes machines.
Act 2. We next talk to Rico Malvar, distinguished engineer at Microsoft and former director of Microsoft Research Labs, and also member of the National Academy of Engineering and an IEEE fellow. Rico grew up in Brazil. He did his BS at Universidade de Brasília from 1974 to 77, and then his MSc at the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro from 1978 to 79. He talks about, among other things, using punched card computers.
When in your life did you encounter your first computing machine or computer?
I was already in college. It was my second year of college. It's the first time I took one of those scholarships for students for research purposes. So universities always have this. It was one of those undergraduate research opportunities, and I applied for and I got it. And I remember with Professor Carlos de Moura, who was a professor in the mathematics department, more on applied math. And I talking to him and say, "Oh, Rico, we can use the computer here." And I say, "Aha, computers, that sounds good." Because math plus stuff that you build and work. So I'm not going to build a computer, but I'm going to get to play with the computer. So it was great because then I got introduced to numerical math, applied calculus, and he was a great advisor. I still am in touch with him to this date. Just the other day, he's been retired a long time ago, but it's nice to see that, after all these years, 50 plus years, we're still in touch. And that's how I got introduced. And the funny thing is that the computer, remember, we're talking 1975 in Brazil, third world country. And the computer was an IBM 1130 that we programmed by punched cards in Fortran.
Punch cards, yes. Most of our listeners haven't seen one, let alone use one. Tell us more.
In fact, I was not even entitled to type on the machine. I had to write carefully in coding sheets, send those sheets to the people who would then type on the machines. So I was not able to actually type. They didn't have enough terminals for the students to type. So they have professional typists, and we would have to write by hand our code.
So there were only certain people who were certified to type and essentially create the punch cards.
Exactly. Yeah.
How long did it typically take for computation to finish once you submitted the punch cards?
Oh, it was typically like, that's a good question. We would submit it and then they would say, yeah, come back tomorrow, maybe in 2 days. And your tiny little program will be ready a couple of days from today, which was completely crazy. But, that's how we started 50 years ago.
The output of the program would also be on punch cards?
Typically, the output would be printed. They would say, don't write programs that generate more punch cards, just do printouts. And then again, we would have to go to a room and ask somebody, do you have a printout for me? And then that's how we knew if the program, and every now and then the program did not run correctly. And they say, oh, you got the printout. Oh, there's a bug. 2 more days to run it again. So the productivity was very low.
Finding bugs in programs must have been really, really hard back then.
It was.
What stage in your career did you stop using punch cards and move to the new kinds of computers?
That was 75. Then 2 years later, I was graduating. And then 79, a few years later, after my master's, the master's was mostly theoretical. But then I was back to being more practical. But at that time, we had terminals. So the university, so now I'm talking 1979. We had a new computer, the Burroughs computer, which was much better than the tiny IBM, and it had terminals. So we started programming with terminals with a very simple operating system, much simpler than the Linux of today. But it's good enough that we start thinking about files and typing and things. So then it became easier.
So just in a few years.
I moved back to the more normal, go to the terminal and do your program there and see the results instantly.
So it's 1974 and you go to the Universidade de Brasilia for your BS, and then 2 more years after that at Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro for your MS. And then right after that, you became a professor. I'll ask you a little bit about that. You also mentioned that you essentially went to your local university because the tuition was free for the locals. Tell us a bit about your bachelor's program in electrical engineering. At what point of time do you think, you already mentioned earlier that research was something that was ingrained in you by your math teacher. At what point in time did you think this thing called research is potentially interesting and something that I might want to do?
It's a good one. And it was really about college. And as I mentioned to you, when I took that undergraduate research opportunity doing numerical calculus and things, and then both my advisor and me said, well, we do like to explore things. And then he told me a little bit more about what is research. See, people do research, they go beyond, they study things, they invent things, they write papers about those things. And then he would actually carefully select a few papers that even I, midway through college, would be able to read and understand to some. See, this is kind of what a researcher does. You could do well on that. And I had some mixed feelings because I felt I would be more building things as a true engineer in the real world. But being a researcher was also cool. And I figure, and then he would tell me, you can be both. Why don't you study enough, go through grad school, become a researcher, and then try to apply that in the real world, because then you can maybe do more advanced things. And I said, okay, that's a good thing. So at that time, the more I spoke to him, the more I built the idea, I think I want to go to grad school. And then my parents, of course, said, but of course you want to go to grad school, so go for that. So it was like that. So by the time I finished college, it was pretty certain, okay, as long as I find the opportunity and I qualify for, I'm going to go for grad school. And that's why I went to Rio, because they had a very good master's program. And that, especially at that time in Brazil, people would really first do the master's and then think if they want to do a PhD or not. Very rarely somebody would go in already to do a PhD and get the master's along the way. It was more like, I'm going to a master's program, and that's another story if I want to do. So I took a step at a time and I did the master's first. Then I came back to Brasilia, started teaching a little bit, applied for a scholarship to come to the US to do the PhD, and that's how it happened. So I did master's, worked a little bit as a entry-level professor for 3 years, and that's when I took off to do my PhD.
Was there a PhD program in Brazilian universities back then?
Yeah, actually there was, and at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Not that great. It's a lot better now. They were in the early days of putting together a PhD program. So my master advisor, with whom I have kept in touch as well, he always said, look, you can get a great master's program here. We have a good program. We're good professors. But if you want a PhD in signal processing, you're going to have to go to the US or Europe. You need to leave because we don't have programs at the right quality. So he also advised me well.
And it was common for universities to hire faculty with a master's degree?
Today, no. Today is just like here. Your PhD is a requirement. But at that time, because there weren't that many people with PhDs, they would say, look, we will hire you at the assistant professor level, not on a tenure track, right? So you're not counting years for tenure, but you can already be here in the faculty and start learning to be a professor and all of that. But then within a certain period of time, you have to start a PhD program. If you don't start, you're out. On the other hand, if you do start in a good school, you get a leave of absence to go get your PhD, come back, and then you come back on a tenure track position. And that's roughly the path I took.
It sounds like it's a stepping stone by the universities to encourage young aspiring researchers to get a PhD.
Exactly. And the equivalent of NSF in Brazil, the CNPq, they actually created, at that time, it was actually quite big program of scholarships to pick up the best young folks in Brazil and give them the scholarship so they could go to places like MIT and other places. And in fact, when I went to MIT, I had a whole set of colleagues from Brazil. There were like 20 of us or something like that.
So somewhat along those lines, I want to ask, so from your batch, the BS students batch, Bachelor of Sciences class in electrical engineering, what fraction of them would you say went to graduate school and what fraction of them did other things in their professional career?
Well, it turns out that employment opportunities in Brazil were quite limited at that time. Today is much better because, the world is flat and there's less difference among countries these days. But at that time, it was difficult. So the percentage of folks who actually continue with an engineering career was only maybe 20%. Other people would say, okay, I have an engineering degree, but there is a job here in the government being an accountant. I'm going to take that. I'm going to take some accounting courses. I'm going to take that because that pays well. And I couldn't find a job as an engineer. Or, and I would say a small percentage, maybe 5%, I'm not sure, but probably not much more than that, like me, went off and continued their studies on grad school, roughly speaking. Today, the percentages are a little better because we have the programs there. There's a much more vibrant industry to absorb the people and so forth.
So back then, many studied engineering because they were interested in it. However, there was not really a job market for.
Not really a path to be an engineer, really a professional engineer. So they did something else.
So if you went to your local office, the accountant or whoever is running the office there, you might meet them and they might actually turn out to be an engineer, very well trained.
Exactly. And that was actually quite common, as much as almost half the class.
That brings us to Act 3. We talk with Amr El Abbadi, Professor of Computer Science at UC Santa Barbara. Amr did his bachelor's in computer science from Alexandria University in Egypt during 1976 to 1980. He also talks of punched card computers and, among other things, the high percentage of women in the computer science program back in Egypt back in those days.
I want to talk about your choice of going to Alexandria University and also your choice of the major. Is it common or was it common for students back in those days to choose a university that was close to where they stayed? Or was there like a national competition, I guess, based on the baccalaureate exam? And then also, how do you choose your major? Is it just based on your score in the exam, or is it something else?
So it is a national competition. So we are ranked across all of Egypt, and I could have gone to given my grades, I could have gone to any university in Cairo, for example. But like you mentioned, it was very typical to stay with one's parents and stay in the local school. And frankly, Alexandria University is one of the best universities in Egypt. So there was, I don't think it was an issue. That wasn't discussed even. The more significant discussion was whether to go into engineering or medicine. So the top students typically went into medicine, and I had excellent scores, so I could have gone to medicine. I decided to go to engineering, and that was a big debate, kind of, not within my family, meaning my parents, but with friends or uncles and aunts. Why aren't you going to medicine? This is the right thing. And then when I got into engineering, the first year is what's called preparatory. So we study everything. I did mechanical engineering, sketch drawing, design, chemical engineering. And then again, there is a competition to go to the various departments. And I decided I wanted to do computer science. It was this really nascent department and discipline. I mean, we are talking about in 1976, Alexandria University had a computer science department, 4 years of education. And I remember having discussions with many, again, with family, friends, and elder uncles and aunts, discussing, why are you going to do computer science? Study a solid discipline like electrical engineering. Now, you can do electrical engineering, it's an established, and then if you want later on, do computer science. But it was attractive, and Alexandria had a very interesting department.
When was the first computer that you actually used?
So in my first year in computer science, I did use an IBM with punch cards. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure if it was a 360, probably. But then after that, we had a PDP-11, and that's the one that I used. So my first language was Fortran, which I used the punch cards on. And then we had BASIC, and I used the PDP-11. I remember sitting on a terminal and working on it. But with the punch cards in my first year, we had to give it in the day before and wait for the response and get out And then you have a bug and all that stuff.
Yeah, debugging is very hard with punch cards.
Yes.
Would it take like a day or two to get the results back?
So it took a day to get back the results. So we would submit our bunch of cards and then we would get back something the next day.
And the output was that was printed output?
Printed output.
And then at what point did you transition? I guess you mentioned PDP 11.
Yes,
was that
11,
when you transitioned to using the more traditional?
Yeah. So that was when we switched to a screen-like environment. And I think we started, I'm sure we did BASIC.
It's pretty amazing that there was a computer science department in Alexandria back in 1976 when even many US universities at that year did not have a computer science department. They kind of was rolled into math department. So that's pretty amazing.
Yes, Alexandria had and still does, I claim, has a strong computer science heritage. There were founding members. So I was definitely not the first class even. There are seniors to me, at least 3 or 4 years senior to me, who graduated. Before that, it used to be part of electrical engineering. And there were 2 or 3 founding members of the department who were very influential. Naim Abu Talib, Yahya al-Hakim, who had studied in the US and gone back and decided to found this department. Those were the more senior faculty, even for me at the time when I joined. Afterwards, there was a more junior cadre of faculty who had also gone to the US. I mean, I remember a particular professor, Dr. Abdullah, who had gotten his PhD from Stanford and then came back to Alexandria and had a philosophy in how to teach data structures and insisted on doing things where he took a batch of students and said, I will teach them 2 or 3 years in a row. And it was like he believed in this apprenticeship model where you work with, and those were small classes. So one very big advantage of computer science at the time was that we were only 30 students.
A small class, yes.
It was a small class and there was a strong interaction between the professor and the students. It was also, compared to the US today, it was more diverse. We had more women students.
What fraction would you say were women?
So I think it was maybe 40%, like
40. Wow.
16 students were probably women. And I still, when I go back to Egypt, I meet some of them and they were all successful in their careers as engineers and heads of IT departments, etc. So it was a very good environment to grow up in and flourish in. We did a project. We built a Z80 and we took the processor and built the whole architecture, the memory, the RAM. I remember spending hours and hours for our final engineering projects on this.
The fraction of women in Egypt, has it stayed at that 40% level in computer science or has it gone down?
Okay, I can't be specific about the percentages, but in general, it is more than in the US. I've seen this even in conservative Arab countries. So I've taught I've given lectures in Qatar, in the Abu Dhabi, in the Emirates, and there is segregation, but there is a bigger number of female students and even faculty. There are some departments that don't have native Arab professors, male professors, but have female professors.
But why do you think that is? Why do you think there are more women there than in the US or Europe in computer science?
That's a good question that I'm sure people have studied this. Okay, there are multiple reasons probably, but one of them is I think in the US we have a very hacker-oriented macho attitude towards programming. And I think we didn't have this at the time, and I doubt it exists now. Also, as a career, it was viewed rightly or wrongly as, compared to other engineering professions, this was actually a reasonable day job for women Not that I necessarily believe in this, but this is a societal view. So as a result, it was acceptable. And in Egypt, in general, if you have the good grades, it doesn't matter whether you are a man or a woman. Your parents want you to persist. And I don't think it's even a class issue. It's just if you have the good grades, there is this opportunity.
And as you mentioned, many of the classmates that you had, including the women, had very successful careers years later as well.
Yes.
I want to ask a little bit about your first steps into research. Did you get involved in research while you were at Alexandria?
Not really, no. All my memories are of this project that we did, but I didn't get involved in much research. This was a big shock when I came to the US.
So now, moving forward a little bit in your timeline, you're nearing the end of your stay, your bachelor's degree at Alexandria. You're thinking, okay, next steps. What options were you considering at that point?
So I was clearly heading towards an academic career, and I was appointed in my university in Alexandria as the first step. In Egypt, it's called a teaching assistant, but it's the first step in the professional career, an academic career. So I was appointed, and I taught actually for 1 year there. And the typical expectation was that you take classes and you get your master's degree, and then you travel abroad and get your PhD. Now, the master's typically took 2 or 3 years. And at the time, there was obligatory military service for all males. Except there is one loophole if you are a single son. And I only have a sister. And so I did not have to do military service for 1 or 2 years. So as a result, during that first year, I wanted to do something more than, so I could leave. Everybody else had to stay and do a master's because they could do it concurrently with their military service. So I remember in December of that, or November of that year, a cousin of my father visiting us, and he was a professor from North Carolina, NC State, control theory and optimization. Industrial engineering, and he said, why stay here and do a master's? Why don't you just go to the US and start doing real research and exploring things? So that's changed my attitude, and he convinced me I should apply at that time, so I did.
And this teaching assistant that you mentioned, was that after you finished the bachelor's degree at Alexandria?
Yes. So I spent 1 year after the bachelor's, and then I did 1 year where I was a teaching assistant. I took some graduate classes in the department for a master's that I never finished, and I taught some classes as a teaching assistant.
So you finished Alexandria in 1980, then you taught from 1980 to
for 1 year,
and then you came to the US in 81.
Yes.
When you applied to US universities, did you consider other places nearby, like the European universities or other places at all?
No, as I said, it was motivated by this visit of my father's cousin. And at the time I wasn't very prepared. So I only applied to 4 or 5 universities. I wasn't even sure how it would go. At the time, I didn't know hardly anything about the universities in the US. So it was a random application set. And I was very lucky that out of the 4 that I applied to, only Cornell accepted me. And I really credit Professor David Grease, who was at the time he was the graduate advisor in charge of admissions, and he saw something in my application because I didn't have, Alexandria University wasn't on the map at the time. My grades were good, but but he saw something, and I really I think David played an important role in my move to Cornell.
If you haven't already done so, please listen to the previous segments in the show. We covered Yugoslavia in episodes 1 through 4, Brazil in episodes 5 through 8, the Middle East in episodes 9 through 12, US Virgin Islands in episode 13, and China in episode 14, and several anonymous narrators featured in episode 15. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes from the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast as we visit other parts of the world. All the music used in episodes of the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast is royalty-free. All voice recordings were performed with and are reproduced with full consent of narrators and participants. You can find music credits on our website. Join the online discussion about this podcast on all major social media, including Twitter and Facebook, with the handle CSImmigrant and hashtag CSImmigrant. And of course, the episode guide is available at our website, csimmigrant.org. This is the Immigrant Computer Scientists Podcast.